So far, we've dealt with fractions, and now we want to add two more number systems that are just a different way of expressing the kind of information that we might express with a fraction. We want to talk about decimal and percent expressions of quantities, expressions of numbers. When you deal with a decimal, you're really dealing with a different way of expressing a fractional part of something. If we have the decimal 0.3, or more properly read, 3/10. Remember your decimal places? The first one to the right of the decimal point is tenths, then hundredths, then thousandths, 10,000ths, and so on. So when you write a decimal number, you're really writing a quantity that is a different way of writing a fraction, only the fraction is always going to have as its denominator either 10, 100, 1,000, and so on. In fact, that's one way that we could take a number, take a quantity that's expressed in the decimal form, and we could change it to its equivalent amount, its equivalent quantity, expressed as a fraction. We can write what we read. The correct way to read this number is 3/10. So if we simply write that as a fraction, we would have the fractional equivalent of that same quantity. I simply wrote as a fraction what I read as a decimal. If I have this decimal quantity, I would read that 8/100ths. This is the tenths place, this is the hundredths place. I would read that as 8/100ths. So if I wanted to convert that decimal form to its fractional equivalent, I would simply write 8/100. And of course, you know that whenever you have a fraction, you want to see if you can reduce it, because we always want to write fractions in their reduced form, their simplest form. And 8 and 100 both have 4 as a common factor. So if I took 8 and divided it by 4, that would give me 2. And 100 divided by 4 would give me 25. So the fraction 2/25 is the same quantity as the decimal 8/100ths. They are expressing the same portion of a whole. When you say you have 8/100ths, you're also saying you have 2/25. Those are equivalent quantities. Let's suppose we had this decimal value. Well, again, this is tenths, hundredths, so that would be 45/100 if I wanted to write it as a fraction. And I can reduce that. Both of those numbers are divisible by 5, aren't they? Remember, numbers that end in 5 or 0 are always divisible by 5. If I take 45 and divide it by 5, I get 9. If I take 100 and divide it by 5, I get 20. So the fraction 9/20 is expressing the same quantity as the decimal 45/100ths. Let's try another one. Say we had 0.125, or better, more properly read, this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, so this would be 125,000ths. So to write it as an equivalent fraction, I would write 125/1000, and then I would reduce that. And if we reduce this fraction completely, 125/1000 would reduce to the fraction 1/8. So decimals are simply another way of expressing part of a whole. And we can find the equivalent fraction by taking that decimal, writing what we read, and then simplifying, reducing that fraction if possible.